Hi friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Katey, and today we are getting started with the Palestinian Reading Challenge. I first heard about this through my friend Sonia Solomon, who linked me to Sim Kern's video. And this challenge is in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians and is encouraging us all to read more Palestinian authors and to support them in the publishing industry. So it is the 1st of June, so the reading challenge starts today. I only just heard about it today though. It goes for a full 6 weeks, so we've got plenty of time to pick up some books and get stuck in. So I have ordered quite a few books. So as those books arrive, I will unbox them and share them with you. I'm very excited. I do have 3 Palestinian books or books by or about Palestine on my shelf at the moment. One I've already read, was recommended to me by Sonia, and I've recommended to you several times, is This Is Not a Border. This is a wonderful book. I've already read it though, so won't be reading it for this challenge. Both of these books actually are by Raja Shahade, and I've had them both on my shelf for a little while. I picked this one up because we actually read it as part of my book club that I host last year. It was one of the last ones we read together before I had to take my break. And I did start this on audiobook. I just never finished it, because when I'm not doing well mentally, I just really struggle to concentrate. And this was a book that I really wanted to sort of be present for. So I knew I'd get back to it, and I feel like now is the perfect opportunity to do so. I was originally drawn to this author partly because of my interest and solidarity with Palestine, but then also to him specifically because he writes a lot about walking. And if you've followed me for any length of time, you'll know that walking and bushwalking, just walking in general, is like a huge part of my life and my spirituality and my mental well-being. Like, I love walking. So my memory of starting the audiobook for this one was that it was a very sort of detailed like meditation on his experience of walking the hills of Palestine, but he also interweaves sort of like the cultural context and like the history of Palestine and the occupation of Israel as well. But he's very much focused on his experience of the land. And so these walks detail a period of time across which he changes and a lot around him changes. So I think it makes sense for me to start with this one, seeing as I have already started the book, and while I'm waiting for my other books, I might as well get started on the challenge. I don't remember when I was first introduced to the plight of the Palestinians. I don't know, I'm sure I like vaguely remember seeing stuff on the news about different conflicts that were going on between Palestine and Israel. But I think the first time I became aware of the situation in terms of the colonization and the oppression, I think was probably when I moved to Melbourne and I started getting more into activism. And in particular here in Australia, the Aboriginal struggle is very like rooted in place, obviously, but then it's very influenced by, and it really values international solidarity with other peoples who are being occupied and colonized. And solidarity with Palestine was something that was spoken about a lot and still is. So that is sort of when it became introduced into my awareness. And I suppose the other reason that I feel like, especially people in countries like Australia, the US, the UK, we can't get out of this conversation because our governments are directly funding Israel. It's not something that's just happening on the other side of the world for a lot of us. It is something that our governments, the people who represent us, are actively funding and supporting. So this is just going to be a vlog of the next 4 to 6 weeks, however long it takes me to get these books and read through them. And I'm going to share with you my experience and also hopefully share with you some suggestions for books that you can read too. So I've just finished Palestinian Walks, and spoilers, I loved it. I thought it was beautiful. I was sort of like inclined to like this anyway because I tend to love people talking about walking and their own experiences. I will say though that I much preferred reading the book to listening to the audio, and that's not like shade at the person who reads the audio at all. Just for me, this sort of writing and this sort of style, I find I enjoy more when I just get to take my time with it. So Raja is a Palestinian. He lives in the occupied territory of the West Bank in Ramallah. And he is also like a human rights lawyer, and he really focuses on land law. So at the beginning of the book, he is not only taking us on these walks and describing these walks and his experience of the hills, he's also talking about how he as a lawyer has sort of been representing Palestinians in Israeli court, fighting for their land. And so he details some of the really messed up, corrupt sort of practices that the Israeli government uses to justify taking away land from Palestinians so that they can continue to sort of spout the lie that they are only occupying land that is unowned, which is not true. He says at one point, the ideological position that the West Bank belonged by divine edict to Israel was given full force in secular legal terms and through elaborate administrative arrangements that ensured that the land was annexed to Israel in every aspect except by name. This book covers decades in time, so as the book progresses, so does the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and the situation certainly escalates. So Raja really vulnerably and honestly explores his own frustrations and anger, and even his resignation at times to what is happening to Palestine and Palestinians. So even though it covers really heavy, important topics that I think we all need to know more about, the backdrop of this is the beautiful hills and the landscape of Palestine. And even though we do talk a lot about the destruction of that beautiful land and how that impacts Raja and his people, it also effectively works as sort of like a calming, soothing backdrop to a conversation that could feel like overwhelming and inaccessible to some people. I don't know if that makes sense, but just for me, every time Raja would step back into just, detailing his walks, even though, we still had that political overlay, when we kind of just stepped back into the walks and the hills, it allowed me space to breathe and to just sort of sit with these uncomfortable emotions and thoughts that were coming up. So even though it's heavy, it's also very readable, and I loved it. I thought it was wonderful. I did also discover last night that I actually have another book on Palestine, which is Palestine Plus 100, Stories from a Century After the Nakba. And from what I understand, this is a collection of short stories by Palestinians that basically imagine what life will be like for Palestine and for Palestinians in the year 2048. So it's a short story collection of science fiction about Palestine. So this is going to be my next read for this challenge. I'm very excited to get stuck into it. Good morning. It is very early in the morning and it is a miserable as hell day here in Melbourne. But last night I finished Palestine Plus 100. I really enjoyed reading this. I enjoy anthologies. I quite like short stories, and I really liked the concept of this. It really was a look at 100 years from the Nakba, so 2048, and just considering what the wind. Oh my God, I don't know if you can hear all of that. That's crazy. So all of the stories are set in 2048, and they just take a speculative look at what Palestine might look like at that point in time. And some of them go for the quite technology sort of approach to sci-fi, just sort of imagining what sort of technology might exist. But despite that technology, the conflict hasn't really shifted all that much. Others are almost sort of borderline hopeless, even though they offer a solution. And I say that because the way that peace is sort of found is through such exaggerated versions of sci-fi, like borderline people thinking it's the end of the world. Another is literally a parallel world, one for Israelis and one for Palestinians. And even though they sort of provided a solution, because of how fantastical and hardcore sci-fi they were, to me that sort of felt hopeless, or it felt like a commentary on how hopeless the situation feels anyway. And I think that's in part because there have been accords and there have been things signed and there have been agreements and they haven't worked, and that Palestinians are still experiencing so much oppression and still being, removed from their homes and whatnot. So I think to me, that's what those stories commented on. As with all anthologies, there's some hits and misses. Some of these stories I really loved, some of them not so much, but that's okay. I will say the one story that to me just stood out far and beyond was The Key. And I think it was the shortest story too. I think what I liked so much about this is the emotional impact. It sort of was speculative, but it was quite small. Some of these stories really tried to go big with the sci-fi concept, but The Key didn't do that. It was quite clear in its focus, and so it was able to sort of build a lot of emotional impact around that, and atmosphere. It was really well done. And because it's so short, I don't want to give too much away, but it's basically sort of like a psychological thriller ghost story that is inspired by the idea that so many Palestinians in 1948 just locked up their house and left, assuming they'd be coming back fairly soon. And so there's stories of them and then their children and their grandchildren still having the key to the home that they had to flee. So that's what it's based on. And whether you get this book or you find another way to read that story, I think it's just Like, it's top tier storytelling in my view. I loved it. So a great little collection with a really cool concept. Now, while we're here, I also wanted to show you some of the other books that arrived yesterday. These are not all of the books that I ordered, but quite a few of the other books that I was keen to read sort of had to go on back order with the suppliers and stuff. These were the ones that were immediately available in Australia. So the first one is The Last Earth, A Palestinian Story. You Exist Too Much, which was one of the recommendations from Sim Kern. Against the Loveless World, which I think is a really pretty cover. And Minor Detail, which is a book that's been on my list for a while, so I'm really glad that this challenge has sort of pushed me to get around to picking it up. I'm not sure which of these books I want to read next, but I guess you'll find out in the next jump cut. I know I said I was going to read one of those 4 books next, but then this came in the mail and I got stuck into this instead. This is Mural by Mahmoud Darwish, and from what I understand, he is basically like the Palestinian poet. He's a pretty big deal. He passed away in 2008, and the last poem in here is apparently the last he wrote before he passed away. It's called The Dice Player. So Mural takes up most of this book. It's like the first 55 pages, and then we get into the slightly shorter Dice Player. So we get 2 poems in here, and this was beautiful. I've said before many times that I didn't really grow up reading a lot, and I didn't grow up reading poetry, and I haven't read a lot of poetry. So I just don't feel like I'm very good at reading poetry. I don't always feel like I have the language to talk about what I liked, what I didn't like, and why. I also often feel like I kind of just don't always understand poetry. I don't know. I don't feel like a very well-versed, like skilled poetry reader. But what I did was I read Mural out loud to myself last night, and even though I'm sure I wasn't like fully comprehending everything, I was sort of like on the verge of tears the whole time. I don't know. I just found it really moving. It was just touching in a way that I wasn't expecting it to be. It's a lot about him being sick towards the end of his life, I think. At one point he says, "My nurse tells me, you were shivering violently and screaming, oh heart, take me to the toilet. What's the use of my soul if my body's sick and can't evacuate? Oh heart, bring back my footsteps so I can go to the toilet alone. I've forgotten my arms, legs, 2 knees, and how gravity works with an apple, and how the heart functions. I've forgotten Eve's garden at the entry to eternity. I've forgotten the use of my small organs. I've forgotten how to breathe with my lungs. I've forgotten speech. I'm scared for my language. Leave the rest, just bring back my language." And that just like hit. Like that hit so hard, like as a poet, and just like that experience of the unknown and like the fear attached to it all, and just like the loss. So to me, there was just a lot of grief in this. And also sort of like, I don't know, like just almost trying to touch the idea of death in preparation almost. And the Dice Player was more like a meditation on just like the ridiculous nature of chance in life, like from the basics of just being like the 1 in 100 billion trillion chance of even being born, and then just like every single little thing that you have no control over that's just completely chance in life. And I think this one actually hit me a bit more. I don't know whether it's because it's shorter, so it was a bit more punchy, or if sort of knowing that it was the last poem that he wrote. "I have no say in my life, except that I am. When life taught me its hymns, I said, do you have more? So I lit its lantern and I tried to oblige. To life I say, slow down, wait for me until intoxication has dried out in my glass. In the garden all the flowers are ours, and the wind can't unwind itself from the rose. Wait for me so the nightingales don't flee the town square and make me break the rhythm, while the minstrels tighten their strings for the goodbye song. Go slow for me and be brief, so the song won't take long, lest my delivery interrupt the prelude and split it into 2. Let 2 and 2 make 1. Long live life. Take your time and take me in your arms so the wind doesn't scatter me." So I don't know what else to say other than that I thought this was just stunning. I loved it, and I definitely want to read more from him because it was beautiful. And I know that I'm reading a translated work and that I'm not like good at reading poetry, but at least from this experience I can certainly appreciate why he was so beloved. Right, well, I actually am going to read one of those 4 other books now. I lied again. Another one arrived. The Hookah Girl arrived, and this is a cute little graphic novel. It's very short, and in my reading life right now, I definitely needed like something different, like a graphic novel, a kid's book, whatever. This arrived at the perfect time. So it's barely 100 pages, and being a graphic novel, it is very, very quick to read. I read this in one sitting late in the evening on a Friday or Saturday night after work. It's sort of a collection of short stories in a lot of ways. I think they're all like true. This is sort of like memoir. Graphic novel, and they all touch on different experiences and different elements of her experience that this author has had growing up as a Christian Palestinian in America. One of them covers the sort of representation that she's seen in the media of Arabs and of Palestinians, and how it's often very like exaggerated, stereotyped, not helpful, often harmful. She talks about like Palestinian culture, her experience of it, whether that's like the community or food, but then also of the sort of sexism that she's experienced in her family, and sort of like not being encouraged to pursue things that she's passionate about just because she's a girl. She also explores a little bit more her own identity, and given that Palestine was and is a very diverse place, she sort of at one point discovers that she has quite a lot of Italian ancestry that she didn't know about. At the very beginning, she actually discusses the journey to getting this published at all. I think she said she wrote it in 2007, and she tried to get it published through lots of different avenues, and ultimately she was turned down in large part because she was told that her identity was too politicized. Like just being Palestinian and talking about being Palestinian was like sort of a no-go topic. And I think one of the most punchy lines in this whole thing was when she said, "When some continually make a point to assert that Palestinians don't exist, calling yourself the thing that you are becomes an act of defiance." So it's a great little book if you can get your hands on it. It's such a quick read. It covers so much ground, and it really is just all about identity and sort of, I don't know, that sense of identity and like the challenges that come with it, given the politicization of the identity of Palestinians, and also just like sort of growing up in that culture, but in the American setting. It's really good. It's really well done. It's beautifully drawn. And I think it was really cool, like how much ground we covered in this, like from like the sort of harsh realities of her lived experience to also just really sweet celebrations of like culture and like specific food. Like, I don't know, it was beautifully done. Given that it is very short, it's only 100 pages, it is a graphic novel. And then also more than that, like each individual story is so short. Like you really have to think of them more as like snapshots. So there's, as beautiful as it is and as well done as it is, there's not a lot of depth to each of the discussions. She really is just sort of trying to provide snapshots. And she's done that really, really well. Another book has also arrived, and I'm really quite looking forward to this one. It is Salt Houses. And isn't this cover just so pretty? This is a book, I think Sim Kern actually recommended it in their like original sort of like intro video to this challenge, and I have heard really good things about it. So at this point I still have a stack of 5 books. I don't know that we're going to get through them all in this challenge, but that's okay. I'll read them at other points. I definitely want to read at least one more for this challenge though. Oh, and then I also have the other Raja book. So I've got six books to pick from. Not exactly sure which one I want to read next, but you will find out next jump cut. And I think they've all arrived, so I really will be reading one of these next, probably. Hello, it is late, I'm cozied up in bed, but I've just finished You Exist Too Much, so I thought we could have a little quick chat about it. This was an interesting book. It's not too long, and it was a fairly quick read. It's about an unnamed narrator who is a Palestinian American, and she's bisexual. But those two identities, although they are important to her and her character, obviously, they're not really like central to the story. Instead, this is really about like codependent relationships, unhealthy relationships, and also sort of like a fragile or maybe unstable sort of sense of self. Her sense of self is very tied to the relationships that she's in. So we sort of follow her, we sort of jump back and forth in time a bit. It's told in vignettes. So we cover quite a lot of time, but we follow her as she kind of gets into and out of like several different relationships. So we kind of see some of the patterns emerge in her own behavior, and just sort of how so many of those relationships, whether they are sort of like actual relationships or more imagined things in her head, or idealized people that she sort of becomes obsessed with. So there's a lot of like cheating, manipulation, and that sort of stuff throughout the book. And I have to say the narrator, I would not describe her as likable. However, I do feel like the author has like tackled this in a way that feels very vulnerable and honest and genuine. And it's quite sensitive too to a lot of these really kind of challenging, difficult, unpleasant themes. And so even though I didn't always like this main character, I do feel like I had a strong sense of like compassion and care for her, if that makes sense. There is some exploration of like the Palestinian experience in here. There's a few occasions where our narrator travels to Palestine, and especially towards the end, there's quite an explicit example of the sort of prejudice and discrimination that she faces by Israeli soldiers. But primarily, this is a book about relationships and mostly unhealthy ones. At times, this almost read like a YA, although it absolutely is not. The sort of themes that are tackled in here are absolutely, definitely adult. And in a way, I liked that because it made it very easy to read. Everything felt very immediate. So You Exist Too Much, my 5th book for this challenge. So we have come to the end of the Palestine Reading Challenge. I have managed to finish 5 books during the challenge, which I'm pretty happy with. I have all of those other books that we spoke about that I hold sitting pretty on my shelf, and they will be waiting for me when I get around to reading those, because it's important to be reading about Palestine and also just from the voices of Palestinians, supporting them in the publishing industry throughout the year and not just during a challenge. I do also love a challenge for giving us some like dedicated time and space to read these books. Normally at the end of the challenges and stuff, I tend to like rank the books, but I don't really feel like that was the point of this at all, so I don't really feel like I want to do that. I guess I'll just talk about some of the books that I feel like adding a little bit more to and reflecting on here. I think the 2 standouts obviously were for me Mural and Palestinian Walks. Although these are very different, I mean, starting with the fact that one is poetry and the other is non-fiction, I did find that I just loved the writing in both of these books. I found the way that they approached the topics that they were approaching and the way that they were just very vulnerable and reflective, and just, I don't know, both were beautiful writers. I found both of these books just really moving. I feel like I learnt quite a lot about both men in their portrayal of themselves and their sort of exploration of their ideas and their fears and their challenges. And I've left both of these books wanting to read more from both of these authors. Another reason I'm happy that I did this challenge is because it kind of forced me to seek out a book of a different like format or different style. And so finding like a little graphic novel was a real gem, I think. I was really happy to discover this one. I find with anthologies and non-fiction, I tend to sort of just like buy books that I know that I'm interested in, and I'm happy to leave them on my shelf for however long until I get to them. So I'm grateful that this challenge finally got me to read Palestine Plus 100, because this one's been on my shelf for a little while. And I enjoyed this premise and this sort of project so much that I have also ordered now Iraq Plus 100. I don't know how many books are in this like Plus 100 series, but I did find one more at least, so I'm excited to get into that. And I always enjoy reading short stories, but the key in here was just like, I don't know, I loved it so much, and I think it will be a short story that I'm thinking about and talking about for a long time to come. And then You Exist Too Much, which is such a heavy title, and when the main character's mother said it to her, it hit, it hurt, you felt it. This was definitely the most contemporary feeling of the books that I read this month. And I liked that we sort of got elements of the challenges of just the Palestinian experience and identity in this, but that we also explored so many other elements of this character's life, including her bisexuality, and then also those elements of mental illness and addiction as well. It was a really interesting read, and even though I didn't always like this character, I did like care for her, and I think it definitely added a nice variety to the other books that I was reading for this challenge. Aside from the graphic novel, The Hookah Girl, which I read in one sitting, this was the easiest book for me to read. I got through it very quickly. I think in part that is like the very contemporariness of the book. I read a lot of books that sort of feel like this one, but then I think there is also that element of it sort of sometimes reading a bit like a YA. It's very accessible language, which did give a very different feel from all of the other books that I read for this challenge. So I'm glad that I did get a chance to read this one in the mix. I actually pulled out all of the books that I had left for this challenge and asked Blair to pick one. And I read out the blurbs to him and everything, and he picked this one because green is his favorite color. And I'm glad he did, because it was a great read. And the fact that decisions are just so easy for him, I cannot relate. Anyway, that's my little wrap up here. Thank you to Sim Kern for creating the video that introduced me to this challenge, and for my friend Sonia for letting me know that it was a thing and that it was going on and encouraging me to participate. Sonia is actually a Palestinian writer herself, so I will leave some of her links in the description box below so you can discover her work and support her too. During this challenge, I was also trying to read and listen to a few other bits and pieces about Palestine and from authors who are Palestinian. So I will leave some links below if you'd also like to check out some other bits and pieces that I found interesting. So that is the end of this reading challenge for me, but it is not the end of this discussion, I hope. I hope it's something that we keep reading about, keep talking about, keep raising our voices about, keep attending protests for, all of the rest. Because the independence, freedom, and self-determination of the Palestinian people and their right to return is, I think, one of the most pressing human rights issues in the world today. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got some ideas for some books to read, whether it's one of the 5 that I have read or one of the several others that I showed you that I hauled during this video. Let me know if you have read any books for this challenge or if you have any other recommendations for me by Palestinian authors. I would love to hear those. And until next time, so much love. Bye.